Welcome, everybody. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to our next version of our DXC Tech Talks. Our topic today is cyber warfare, and more specifically, are your applications prepared for the battle? Talk a little more about that, but what I want to do is introduce myself first. My name is Jeff Massuston. I'm part of the product management team working on strategies for application security. With me, I have some colleagues, Roger Smith, who's the global offering manager for application security. And we also have Buck Houston, who's a strategic global alliance director for Micro Focus, one of our strategic partners. So really what we want to do is talk a little bit about app security. I mean, security is important. Everybody knows that, right? But wanted to focus in just a little bit on the application side. Something that's not always done very well. People don't always, pay attention to that aspect of it. And I think it shows, but it's gaining a lot more recognition as a place we need to go. And quite honestly, it's really important. So when you think about the three tenets of security, right? Number one would be confidentiality. Number two is going to be integrity. And number three is availability. Those come into play when you're talking about app security, right? Because we got to make sure that we keep the data confidential. We have the systems that are available. And, obviously we're protecting information as well. That's key and important for all enterprises. So I think
Absolutely.
What we want to do. Yeah. So Buck, can you tell us a little bit, what do you view as why app security is so important these days?
Yeah, you know what? When you look at application security today and the application marketplace, applications are certainly under attack, right? In fact, the latest figure is over 90% of the breaches involve the application layer. So you have these complex organizations, they've got hundreds of applications, there's going to be a weak point in there somewhere. And really the nefarious and the bad guys, I think, are really preying on that and creating strategies to breach organizations at the application layer. So if organizations aren't building a dynamic, forward-looking application security program, the nefarious and bad folks are going to come get after them. The other thing I'm seeing too is the amount of regulation coming into the marketplace. You look at something like GDPR. We are now living in a world where GDPR is active, right? And tens of thousands of organizations and businesses in EMEA are now online with new regulations, but not only EMEA, but globally. So when you look at things at PCI, HIPAA, and various other regulatory requirements in government and in utilities, building application security at the application layer to adhere to these requirements is very, very important and is something that needs to be constantly considered. And the last thing I think we need to consider is the cost of a breach. It is absolutely skyrocketing, right? Their latest figure right now is 7.35 million per breach. And if you look at a small or a medium-sized organization, a breach could actually break an organization. Like it could legitimately change the trajectory of the organization into a downward spiral. But when you look at the larger organizations, Jeff, we all saw Equifax, right, last year. That breach cost is 400 million and rising. You look at Yahoo from 2016, they had over 400 million user accounts breached. And they were in the process of being acquired by Verizon. So that actually affected the buyout value of Yahoo by over $500 million. So really, what I'm seeing here in the marketplace is if organizations aren't constantly thinking about a dynamic, evolving application security program, it is a big risk in their organization. Don't you agree?
Yeah, Buck, this is spot on, right? You look exactly what's happening in the marketplace. These breaches are happening more often, more frequently, right? And to your point, they're all happening, or not all, but the majority of them are happening at the applications layer, the successful ones anyway, right? So we've got to do something. We've got to make, this a focal point. I think we've got to look exactly at how people are protecting data within their organizations. But more importantly, look at how the attackers are targeting us. And that switch, right? They looked for years over at the infrastructure. We spent a lot of money, protecting the infrastructure side of the house. But, for years, I think a lot of people avoided the applications, a lot of it because they just didn't really understand it. And, developers, they're great at taking business requirements, translating them into code, but they're not security people. And that's not their job, and we shouldn't expect them to do that. And I think that's where some organizations tend to get lost, is they think, our apps guys, they'll take care of it. They know exactly how to do all this stuff. And while they're concerned about it, they're not experts, and we shouldn't consider them to be experts. We've got to back them up with the tools, the processes, partnerships, whatever it's going to take, but we've got to be able to support them on that journey. There's one thing that comes to, go ahead, Buck, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, finding really good application security people is very difficult, right? So leveraging and a broader program with some expertise in the marketplace is really key. And having a really broad client base, or a broad set of experts is key. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. That perspective. Oh, go ahead, Roger. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, Buck, and in terms of what you're talking about earlier too, in terms of the impact of the business, right, and the significant financial impact of the business, which, like you said, is significant, can make or break a business, right? But there's also the impact of the business's brand and reputation. Again, you look at Equifax from a little while back, and Yahoo and others, right, and it makes their customers wonder, do they want to do business with them or not?
Yeah, and the key point you touched on, Buck, too, finding resources, that know application security, it's really tough, right? Because they have to have an apps developer background. I mean, I'm an old apps dev guy, right? And they get all that perspective, but having somebody who has that security knowledge on top of it, that understands the OWASP top 10, that understands security vulnerabilities, how do you block from those? How do you implement best practices? It's not an easy task. So I think a lot of organizations are challenged trying to find the right resources and be able to put up the proper defenses. And, key point here is I was just reading a report the other day, and they call this the global median dwell time. And what that means is by the time that an attack has happened, or there's evidence of an attack in the network, till the time that it's actually recognized and there's actions to remediate it, right now the median time is 101 days. So that means you got people in your environment attacking, trying to steal information for about 3.5 months before you realize it and start working to stop that. So, I mean, that's critically, a serious component. You think about that from the larger perspective and say, all right, so what do we have to do to protect that? So, Roger, kind of want to talk to you. We've had these conversations about defense in depth. What is defense in depth, and how do we utilize it from an application security perspective?
Thanks, Jeff. Great question, and hello everyone as well. So defense in depth, it's a really important concept. It's one that's been around for a long time and is really a best practice in information assurance. So defense in depth is simply the process of employing multiple layers of security throughout the architecture in order to better protect an IT system. So an analogy. Back in the medieval times, I said this has been around for a while, but back in the medieval times, right, when building a castle, they would usually include walls, moats, turrets, other defenses, trebuchets, other things in the design in order to better protect what's inside that castle. And this approach helped to protect against different types of threats and also helped ensure that there was no single point of failure in the castle's defenses. And that same concept can be applied to IT security. So things like access controls, firewalls, intrusion detection devices, and other defenses that can be implemented in order to increase the overall resilience and effectiveness of your security measures. So again, this concept is really, it's nothing new. I remember it being drilled into me when I was a relatively new young IT architect. But traditionally, we focused more on applying these measures at the network and the infrastructure layers, like the example I gave before, the access controls, the firewalls, et cetera. But the same concept can and it should be applied to application security as well.
So, hey, Roger, it's really important you're talking about that. So we need to take a layered approach to application security, correct?
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you want to start with application security testing. So to me, that's the foundational layer of a really good applications defense in depth strategy. So application security testing identifies potential security defects and vulnerabilities in your application's code. And when I go to talk to clients about application security, it's often the first thing that they want to talk about, application security testing. It's a well understood practice, and there's some very mature tools out there on the market that can be used to automate and execute the testing. So it's a really good place to start. But in talking defense in depth, right, we don't want to stop there. So one of the other things you can think about is training your developers on secure coding practices so that they're not introducing security defects into the code in the first place. One of the things we talk about a lot, we recommend a lot, is shift left testing, right? And that's the practice of testing early and often throughout the development lifecycle, which results in higher quality, more secure code. Shift left also helps reduce the cost of development, because it's well known, it's proven, it's 20 times to 100 times or more costly to fix a security defect the later you get in the software development lifecycle. So you still have to test, but what we should also strive for is to continually improve our ability to develop secure code from the start, right? And training our developers on secure coding practices can help with that.
Hey, Roger, what are some of the overlooked areas of defense in depth?
Yeah, so another one, that's a great question, Buck. Another one that should be considered is often overlooked is threat modeling. That's another thing that should be considered as part of a defense in depth strategy. So there are currently more than 100,000 vulnerabilities identified in the US National Vulnerability Database. That number is constantly growing, and there may be up to 20 times or more vulnerabilities that have not yet been identified. And testing can help us find the known types of vulnerabilities in your applications. But threat modeling is a great tool to help make improvements in the application's design and architecture, which can better protect against those unknown threats. A couple of other things to consider as well. Security requirements gap analysis. Often in the early phases of application development, when we're doing planning, often security requirements are overlooked. And security requirements gap analysis is a great practice to help address and avoid that. And that can include not just technical security requirements for the application, but also looking at, like you said earlier, Buck, regulatory requirements and other things that may drive requirements that need to be addressed from an application security perspective.
Hey, Roger, that's a really good point, because you talk about GDPR, one of the big regulations that just come into effect recently, right? And it not just affects EMEA clients, but anyone that does business in that region. So one of the tenets they talk about there, one of the requirements, is to design privacy in. So I think you're spot on when you start talking about all these other approaches and things that you're going to need to do to
Absolutely.
be compliant with regulation.
Yeah, and the penalties for not complying with GDPR are pretty severe, right? And that's certainly a hot topic right now, and rightfully so. So yeah, that's a very good example of that.
Yeah.
And I was going to say something else to consider too is accounting for the open source components in your applications. So at least from what I'm seeing, there are very few applications today that are completely custom developed from scratch. Most use one or more open source components, usually much more as part of the overall application architecture. And it's very important that we account for potential vulnerabilities in those open source components. So software composition analysis is a great technique and set of tools that we can use to help address that.
All right, Roger, this sounds great. I mean, I think, understanding defense in depth really makes a lot of sense, when you start applying it to app security. But how do you implement that? I mean, there's no easy way. There's no easy button to make that happen, right?
Yeah, I wish there was. But no, that's a great question as well, Jeff. So I think one thing to keep in mind, especially today, is the approach for how we build, or how we are building, testing, and releasing modern software is changing, right? So we live today in a software-driven economy. Digital transformation, the move to digital technologies is dramatically changing how our clients interact with their customers, with their partners, right? And it's also changing the speed at which those interactions take place and the expectations around the speed at which those interactions take place. Application software is the basis for those interactions, and the expectations today for how quickly new applications and new application features can be brought to market are dramatically increasing. So speed to value has really become king. And in the applications world, Agile and DevOps are the key enablers for that. And you can't apply Agile and DevOps, at least not sustainably, without addressing application security along the way, right? It can't be an afterthought. You need to proactively address it and build it into your software development processes.
So, Roger, can I say that we need to get rid of that whole DevOps strategy and call it DevSecOps at this point? I mean, we got to include security, right? Or secure DevOps. We need a good viewpoint on how to take that forward, right?
Hey, so you're setting me up here, DevSecOps. I know that's the common term that's used out there in the industry, and it's a great term and it makes sense. Me personally, though, I hate the term only because when it comes to DevOps, right, I don't think you can do DevOps sustainably without taking security into account. So I think DevOps, by its very nature, implies that you're addressing application security. But you know, if it helps to increase the adoption, DevSecOps, I'm great with that terminology as well.
Well, and it's really important, Roger. I mean, I saw a report the other day. I was just reading on the internet, right? And it said they thought that up to 90% of the applications never even go tested for vulnerabilities that get deployed. And that's a pretty scary number. So you've got to build it into the SDLC, right? I don't think there's any way you can avoid it.
Yeah, you have to. And like we talked about earlier, I mean, that is the biggest threat. That's the most common avenue, right, at which successful breaches occurred, right? So it can't be ignored. And I'm seeing that. I'm definitely seeing in my conversations with customers, with clients, an increased interest in application security and recognition, right? That when you're looking at security overall for the enterprise, right, you can't not think about app security. You need to be looking at that piece as well. And again, like I said earlier, app security testing, identifying those vulnerabilities is usually kind of the entry point for those conversations for our clients.
That's great, Roger. So, you know, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about too, you know, we talk about how we got to employ application security, but I think there's a few things that, you know, we got to talk about. That's continuous improvement. I don't think we can just walk in there and say, hey, we're going to just implement some security strategy and then never revisit that governance process.
Absolutely.
I mean, continuous improvement is core to what we have to do around all the security. Application security is no different, right? And Roger, you had mentioned the National Vulnerability Database, you know, over 1 million identified vulnerabilities, and some of the analysis says that it could be 20 times greater than that. You know, those are scary numbers. So I think it's interesting how that continues to grow, and we've got to implement a continuous improvement methodology, or we're going to run behind the attackers, you know, the bad actors out there. I mean, they're looking for the weaknesses. We have got to see if there's some way that we can always obviously continuously improve our process. We have to look at how do we identify vulnerabilities. We got to make sure developers, right, are up to speed on how to maintain secure coding practices. And a lot of that they do through just remediation activities, right? We go through some of the testing and things that you talked about, Roger. You know, as they have to go and remediate and fix those things, they become more knowledgeable now about how they have to go about coding in the future. So I think this really helps a lot of people, you know, from the perspective of understanding security better in the development community, and it really has a big effect. The other thing you talked about, shift left, I don't think you can really underestimate that. You know, you've got to be able to start looking and saying, how do I move left on the SDLC? How do I get security built in from the very beginning, right? We can use techniques like threat modeling in the requirements phase. Even before you write a line of code, potentially, you're able to remediate vulnerabilities. And that's, you know, I think the best protection you can have is avoidance. If we can avoid developing vulnerabilities in our applications, you can't be more secure than that, right? But we can't rely on that. Yeah. So I think we have to implement these activities, the testing and some of those pieces, right, to make sure that happens.
I agree. And I think one of the opportunities with that, Jeff, I couldn't agree more fully, right? I mean, we need to build security in the DNA of how we develop, you know, applications, you know, looking across our development, our security teams, our operations teams as well, right? It needs to be part of, you know, how they all do their day-to-day job. And I think one of the opportunities with testing, especially if you look at centralizing your testing across the enterprise, is the data that you're collecting, right, regarding some of the vulnerabilities and the defects that are being generated during the development process. That's great insight into potential training opportunities for your development teams. It's great insight into potentially some of the effectiveness of the security controls and other things that you're putting in place from a defense in depth application security perspective. And I think, you know, harnessing the value of the data that you're collecting by applying these processes is something that can drive great value.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Roger. And when we talk about continuous improvement, you can't get there without doing some kind of measurement activities, right? You got to look at, you know, the security effectiveness of what you're doing. So you start looking at, say, how do I bring security analytics or just analytics into this process, right? We can look historically at the vulnerabilities we found in our code bases. We can start looking at the analytics perspective, understanding exactly where our developers may be deficient in some areas and understanding security protocols. We can start implementing, you know, activities to get them trained. And I think that's really vital. You know, and then look at AI. I mean, artificial intelligence is going to take over the world, right? And it's no different in app security. If we start implementing AI capabilities like I would take RASP, for example, which is the runtime application self-protection. A lot of tools exist out there right now, but I just see the maturity of those things growing and becoming much more important as we go into the future, right? I mean, AI is going to be able to help stop activities as they happen. So if we have things, monitoring our applications during runtime, and we can shut off a rogue request without completely killing the entire application, that's pretty powerful. Some of those things we can do today, but I think it's going to get a lot better moving into the future.
Agreed. And even just leveraging AI, analytics, and automation in order to at least reduce the effort of our security, our development professionals on at least some of the more mundane things, at least initially, as the technologies continue to mature. But then that will free up their time to focus on the more critical vulnerabilities that have been identified.
Right. One thing that, I just wanted to kind of take note of here real fast too, right, is, we talked a little bit about, regulations, and more specifically about GDPR. Roger, have you seen any I guess, effects of GDPR and what's happening, out in the world there?
Hey, great question. I'd say definitely have seen the effect of GDPR in terms of reach outs, contacts, interest from our clients, and helping them get ready for GDPR in order to be compliant. Making sure, we talked about privacy by design, right? Making sure from an application, from a data, from a network, from an infrastructure, right? From an overall defense in depth perspective, right? That they're ready to be compliant with that and protect the private data within their applications. So definitely seen a lot of impact in terms of need to help our clients with that. I have not seen yet, and I think it just went into full effect relatively recently. I have not seen much in terms of actual penalties that have been applied to customers, to businesses associated with the regulation. Though I have seen, I think there were maybe some private lawsuits or whatnot with Facebook and Google, et cetera, kind of around that, but nothing that I've seen formally from a EU GDPR perspective.
Right. I know I've seen a couple articles, I think, where there's been some penalties already levied against some corporations, right? And some pretty big ones at that. I believe it was Facebook that's already had a lawsuit, and I believe even Google. I have to look at that more, but I think we're going to see the GDPR and the effects that's going to have on a lot of corporations. That's going to be a big impact for everybody, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think it just takes a few organizations to hit the headlines with some big penalties to get the rest of the organizations in gear and really moving. I think what I've seen on the GDPR front is that there's a lot of organizations that are slow to adhere, and they're kind of sitting back and waiting to see how stringent and how aggressive the regulators are going to be, and implementing a multi-year strategy to adhere to it. But I think like you said, Jeff, if we get some big names in the headlines, I think we could have a bit of a boon here in terms of GDPR rush to adhere and comply in the next 6 months. That's my view anyway.
Yeah. Hey, I want to remind everybody out there too, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the YouTube segment, and we'll try to answer those as we go along as well too. So really quick too, I want to talk about just some key points here that we've talked so far. Roger, you talked a lot about defense in depth, and that is so important here. You start talking about layered security, process you're going to have to go to. We can't just say one and done, right? Let me just do testing, for instance, right? We don't want to just start doing that and just say, that's it. That's all we're doing. We got to really look to say how we're going to protect the best. And it's going to take layers of security, right? We can't just, stop at one item. We have to really look at the entire biosphere, the echo environment that we live in. Try to make sure that we employ the right security techniques that's going to protect the data. Number two, I think we heard loud and clear, is we've got to be proactive, right? If we're reactive and waiting for something bad to happen, that's a really scary thing for everybody, right? So you got to be proactive, and the days of being reactive, I think, are over. GDPR, like we were just talking about, those kind of things make you and force you to change your behaviors. And I think a lot of corporations are doing that, right? And it's just a matter of looking and saying, all right, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And try to employ the proper techniques, find partners to help you, whatever it's going to take, but just take that proactive stance. And the third thing I think we're very clear on is we've got to focus on applications. I think our attackers are doing it, right? The malicious actors, they're out there saying, where's the easiest target? We spend a ton of money on network security. It's getting they've hardened that to a certain degree. not impossible to get through, but apps, that's a bit easier. So I think these guys, the hackers, they're lazy, but yet they're really brilliant when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
That laziness comes from, hey, I'm going to find the easiest way in, and that's human nature, and obviously makes a lot of sense, right? But then they're brilliant too because they're collaborating together. It's not just one guy sitting in his basement saying, hey, I wonder if I can do this. This has turned into organized crimes, nation states that are attacking each other. I mean, this really is cyber warfare. And we've got to, make sure that we understand how to win the battle.
Agreed. Well said.
Mm-hmm.
So great. Well, guys, I really want to thank everybody for their time. I think this has been for me, a very informative session talking to Roger and Buck here. And the topic doesn't go away. I think we could talk about this for, weeks on end. And we're never going to get to the bottom of, how do you solve every problem? But I think, we've got some direction and ways that we can implement good security strategies and lower risk for corporations.
Thanks, Jeff.
Any final words, guys? All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for their time. It's been a great session, and we hope you'll attend some of the future DXC Tech Talks. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff.